Hello and welcome to another edition of Across the Line, questions for the 19th National Congress of the CPC. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Today we are joined in our Beijing studio by current affairs commentator Victor Gao Zhikai, and in Cairo we are happy to be joined here by our co-host Yasser Hakim. He's going to brief us on what questions he considers most interesting in addressing issues concerning a healthy and mutually beneficial relationship between China and Africa. Now back to you, Yasser Hakim.
Thank you, and have the pleasure to be working with you on Cross the Line. It's a program that I have been following, and I admire your interviews with your distinguished guests. Since we're talking about today's topic, and that is Africa and the CPC 19th Congress, the question is, how is Africa positioned in China's global strategy? Hi, I'm Yasser Hakim from Cairo. China has been very active in Africa in the last few decades. It has established major economic projects, and its presence can be felt throughout the continent. I've asked several experts to evaluate China's strategy in Africa and show their concerns, if any.
China is now growing as one of, if not the second largest economy in the world, and it is time for it to take lead in that position, moving away from the passive attitude of non-interference. Basically, the principles that were based in China in 1955 on non-aggression, coexistence, and non-interference. But today, in a growing global economy, in a new world order that China is taking lead on, the responsibilities have to be more than just the partnerships, and maybe the definitions of partnerships might be quite different.
Africa needs a clear political stance from China in many issues, especially that Western powers are very clear about their policy in Africa, where it supports nations based on its own benefits. For example, countries such as Italy support Libya for their own benefits at the end. I hope to see more active Chinese policies to face the Western interference.
China today is involved in the resurrection of the Silk Route. China is involved in the BRICS. China supports the United Nations reform and believes that it is a platform for global growth. My main concern as an observer and analyst on the China-Africa relations is how can China maintain its leading role in this new world order that we are talking about, this leadership throughout globalization in Africa.
As Arabs or Africans, we prefer to deal with China than others, because China doesn't enforce any political will on other countries. Its relations are based on friendship and mutual benefits, rather than political interference. The next period of China's strategy will change from a leading economic power to a leading political country.
As we can see, the Chinese economic influence in Africa is very evident and popular with the people and experts here. But the debate, however, is whether China can engage more politically in Africa as it has done economically. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Back to our Beijing studio here, Victor. What do you think of the African policy that the Chinese government adopts since the end of the Cold War? Everybody understands that during the Cold War, we invested a lot in the construction of the Tanzania-Zambia railway station. We sent a lot of medical teams to take care of the African brothers and sisters. But with the end of the Cold War and the end of the Cultural Revolution, I believe our economic presence there is no longer what it was. Namely, we have to follow and respect the law of a market economy. At the same time, we are accused of practicing neo-colonialism in this continent. What do you think of the trade-off? Trading accusations between our side and the Europeans and the Western media reports on the growing influence of China in the African continent?
Now, I would say ever since the end of the 1950s, China's engagement with Africa has undergone several phases. In the 60s and 70s, it was more political than economic, even though, indeed, during that period of time, China helped Tanzania and Zambia building the major railway over there. However, I would say ever since around 2000, for example, the Chinese engagement in Africa is both political as well as economic and trading, to such an extent that China is now the largest trading partner for almost all the African countries, and Africa, mostly because of the Chinese engagement, has become a continent of great hope, and Africa has turned from a forgotten continent to a continent with huge growth potential. And I think China's practice is simple and elegant, that is to treat every African country as an equal, treat them as brothers and sisters with no strings attached, and focused on economic development with a particular focus on infrastructure and connectivity. That brings more hope to the African people and African nations in their capacity building, nation building, and emerging as a great continent of growth opportunities.
Leaders in most of the African countries, particularly those in the sub-Saharan region, want to learn from the Chinese experiences in achieving our economic miracles. But first of all, there are two questions. Whether A, we have a model of Chinese development. Secondly, whether that model could be copied elsewhere.
Well, definitely China has its own success story, which we can share with many African countries. I think of crucial importance is maintaining stability and keep peace abroad. And for many African countries, it's the same case. They need to maintain stability. They need to avoid degenerating into chaos for whatever reason. Sometimes it is, for example, interference by outside forces. Sometimes it was political or domestic instability, and also avoiding regional conflict and war with each other, or even within a particular country. You just also now mentioned some Western countries accusing China of practicing neo-colonialism in Africa. I think they are either completely disregarding what exactly happened under the colonial era, or they completely fail to understand the exact Chinese practice in Africa. I think China needs to share not only its economic development success stories, but also how to maintain stability and how to keep peace. And with these preconditions, I think African countries will have much better chance of growing their economy, raising the living standards of the people, and creating more meaningful jobs for the people.
I was in Johannesburg the year before covering the China-African Dialogue Summit. The subject matter was how to assist the industrialization of the African continent. The issue is whether China could translate its Belt and Road Initiative into actions and realities throughout much of Africa in the hope of building infrastructure, and we've been doing that in Africa, and we've been very successful. So do you think this policy of being inclusiveness will live up to the expectations of most of the African politicians and policymakers, so that we pursue co-prosperity?
Oh, indeed. I think the One Belt, One Road initiative that China is promoting very enthusiastically includes African countries. And it's encouraging to see that countries like South Africa and Egypt, etc., have already become founding members of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and are also very much participating in the rollout of the One Belt, One Road initiative. In essence, I think if the African countries very much focus on working together with many other countries in different parts of the world, in building up infrastructure connectivity, in giving free play to their huge resources, not only in terms of energy resources or mineral resources, but human resources, for example, emphasizing on education and training, and emphasizing on keeping, as I said, stability and maintaining peace, then I think they will be in a much stronger position to achieve higher level of industrialization and engage in globalization in a much more meaningful way. Infrastructure is a major hurdle in Africa for many countries, and one way or another, with Chinese help or with the One Belt, One Road initiative, African countries will benefit hugely from building up their connectivity and infrastructure projects.
Yes, indeed. The learning curve or trajectory of the Chinese development should be shared with our African friends to a larger degree and in many ways. Back to you, Yasser.
Yes, it's very enlightening what your guest, Mr. Victor Zigao, has said, and that's especially the experience, the Chinese experience in economic development, and how this could be a role model for many African countries that try to also improve their economic atmosphere and economic conditions. Obviously, Africa looks very strongly towards China as a partner in its economic and social development. And one concern is some of the news that has been circulating in the last few months, that the Chinese government has been putting restrictions on Chinese companies from investing abroad to maybe avoid the exit of currency and the hard currency from China. And this has brought some concerns whether this will affect or at least slow down China's economic investments in Africa, especially that China has been aggressively investing in Africa in the last few years and decades. So will this have any effect on the Chinese investments and trade in Africa?
And I think the One Belt, One Road initiative will involve many years, and no single country can make it a reality. It would require participation and cooperation by many countries. Right now, almost 100 countries have signed up for this major initiative. All the United Nations organizations and many other international organizations have also signed up with this major initiative. As far as the Chinese capital control is concerned, indeed it is happening, but I think it's more designed to prevent illegal or illegitimate flight of capital from China, and it will not have a major impact on China's engagement with the One Belt, One Road initiative. And I would say if you look at the pipeline of deals involving the One Belt, One Road initiative, involving many Chinese investments in Africa, for example, I think eventually the financing will come along with financing from major Chinese financial institutions, but increasingly also financing by other international financial institutions in the coming years.
Well, that puts a lot of concerns to bed and makes it clear for Africans about the Chinese policy towards Africa in the future. Another question, sir. You know that China, like we said, does not engage politically too much in Africa and prefers peace and development. One other issue is that Africa has been facing a lot the surge of terrorism in many countries in the continent. Will this in any way concern China and Chinese companies when they try to invest in Africa? The instability and violence on the continent, will this deter African capital from coming to the continent?
Indeed, I would say terrorism is a scourge for mankind, and terrorism has many shapes and forms and colors. And we, the mankind, including China and African countries, for example, need to work together to fight against terrorism. And I think if terrorism remains unchecked, it indeed will become a hindrance, if not objection, to FDI into countries where terrorism is running rampant. And I think China and the African countries and many other countries need to work together to find out a common strategy to deal with terrorism. I think we need to work together to fight against terrorism and prevent it from spreading and expanding forces, for example, and eventually we need to triumph against terrorism. That will pave the way and lay a much sound and stronger foundation for investments in these countries.
Thank you, Yasser. We all hope that the opening of the 19th National Congress and the successful conclusion of this landmark event will help usher in a new era for the China-African co-prosperity in the foreseeable future. I thank you so much, Yasser. With that, we come to the end of this chapter of Across the Line, yet another edition of our special series concerning the National Congress of the concerning the 19th National Congress of the CPC. Hello and welcome to another edition of Cross the Line, Questions for the 19th Congress of the CPC. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Today, We are joined in our Beijing studio by current affairs commentator Victor Gao-Zhikai, and we shall also talk to our co-host Guy Henderson in Berlin.
Thank you very much for having me. Here's one of the things I thought would be interesting to get a ground level take on in Europe ahead of the 19th CPC Congress. The question is, what do regular citizens here think that the biggest challenges facing the ruling party in China will be over the next 5 years? As China's global influence grows, so does public interest in and scrutiny of its policies. If you'd asked many Germans 5 years ago, say, what they thought that China's ruling party's biggest challenges would be in the years ahead, most of them might have seemed pretty flummoxed. Well, not now, apparently. In fact, we got some pretty comprehensive answers from business people and young entrepreneurs at one of the capital's best-known co-working spaces. Sorry to disturb you. Let me ask you, China's big challenges in the next 5 years.
In my opinion, the biggest challenge for China is to keep the internal stability and so that it is not falling apart or having too many social unrest.
Hi guys. Thanks for your time. I won't take up too much of it. So, China. Put yourself in China's shoes for a minute. From a European perspective, the next 5 years, increasingly important country in global affairs. What do you think that country's big challenges are for the next 5 years or so?
It's another way of living, another culture, of course. So I think if they want to come together, I mean Europe to China or China to Europe, it's going to be a big gap. So I don't think in 5 years' time it will be closed. So that's a big challenge, I think.
So more the cultural differences. Obviously there's bigger and bigger economic ties, big trading countries, Germany and China. But as someone who's spent time in China, you're thinking it's more of a cultural difference?
Yes, I do believe so. And
if you're sitting in China,
yep.
You're in charge of China for the next 5 years, what do you think its big challenges are?
Population, I think, and also, I don't know, coordinating everything to be regulated. That would be quite hard as well because everything is kind of chaotic in a way.
You're in charge of China for the next 5 years. What are its biggest challenges, do you think?
I think it should play more of a role in the countries immediately located next to it, like Vietnam, for example, the developing economies, and instead of just treat them as second-class citizens, should actually invest in economically viable, sustainable projects more and more, rather than just like trying to let them narrow the income gap, which is never going to happen.
Thank you, Mr. Guy Henderson, for bringing us some of the most interesting questions concerning the future of China. Now, Victor, what do you think are the biggest challenges facing China and the Europe relationship in the next 5 years?
China-EU trade is the largest trade for China as well as for the European Union, and China is the largest trading nation for many European countries. I would say in the coming 5 years, China-EU or China-European economic relations will continue to flourish. However, there are uncertainties about the future of EU, and now that Brexit is happening and there is no sure solution as to what exactly will happen to Britain going forward, and whether there are other members of EU who may follow the suit of Britain in exiting from EU, I think there will be a period of uncertainty that the Europeans need to really get their acts together. Now, as far as Europeans concerned about Chinese development, I think they need to become more confident about the direction of the Chinese economic reform, and they need to really get their acts together to recognize China as a market economy, so that the two China and EU together and many other European countries can have a firmer foundation to develop not only economic and trading relations, but also more and more see eye to eye on major issues in the world. And I think this will give a better direction for China-European development in the coming 5 years and beyond.
The future and unity of the European Union may have been seriously undermined by the following issues, such as the surge of populism, terrorism, refugee crisis, and above all, lackluster performance of most of the economies within the European Union, particularly Brexit, the departure of the United Kingdom, may have dealt a serious blow, devastating blow to the European economy as a whole. So in that case, are we able to take Germany as the absolute strongest leadership of the European Union? Are we talking to Germany and then we talk to the rest of Europe, or European Union?
Well, Europe is not monolithic. I think
the majority of the CDU, Christian Democratic Union, the ruling party of Germany, has been seriously undermined in the recent election. Angela Merkel won the battle, but may have lost the long and enduring war with the populists. So in that case, do you think we should take Germany as seriously as before?
Yes, I think so. I think we need to give Angela Merkel the benefit of doubt. She is the next Chancellor of Germany for the coming few years, and hopefully she will have enough time to get the acts together and also make sure that Germany does not lean to the rightist direction. And eventually I think the new government, coalition government in Germany, will be strong enough to not only make sure that the developments in Germany are well taken care of, but Germany will again remain as a strong force for other European countries and lead the European Union forward in the right direction. And I would say that EU or Europe itself is not monolithic. There are about 50 countries, each with very different economic situations and political circumstances. And from the Chinese perspective, we need to deal with each of the European countries in its own capacity, but also we need to fully respect the EU as an international entity and deal with it in its own capacity. So we need to have a multiple strategy to deal with Europe at the top level, at the EU level, but also on a country-to-country
But I'm afraid
basis.
the political and economic policies of the European Union used to be based on consensus, and consensus building has been the cornerstone for cementing the solidarity of this most successful regional economic bloc. However, we also face challenges from Poland, where discrepancies in perception of same values, quote-unquote, start to meet very serious challenges from within the European Union. Having said this, the transatlantic relationship is also derailed due to the presidency of Donald Trump, who says the European Union got to look after their own problems. The free trade negotiations between the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean have also been mired, and Angela Merkel, the Chancellor, says the European Union got to take its own destination and destiny into its own hands, meaning in the end statement they would not be relying on the United States as it used to for much of the economic cooperation. So do you think in this context China would seize the opportunity and assume the leadership and would have more investment and trade between the two sides?
Well, definitely. I think ever since Mr. Donald Trump became the President of the United States, the differences between the United States on the one hand and many European countries have become more and more obvious. And I think the tensions between Germany and the United States are obvious for all of us to see. I think as far as China is concerned, we do not need to jump into this evolving situation and take advantage of the developments in the situation. I think China needs to stand firm on matters of principle. We need to stand firm on, for example, our position on globalization, as President Xi Jinping has emphasized on many occasions, working for the common destiny of mankind, because in doing so, without picking sides, I think European countries can come to their own conclusion that China is standing on the right policies and the right principles, and cooperation, closer cooperation between China and Europe will make better sense, especially when the United States is walking in the opposite direction by going out of the Paris Accord, by adopting many questionable policies on major issues in the United States and on the world today. And I think cooperation between China and Europe will be closer in the coming few years.
Thank you so much. I believe Mr. Guy Henderson will have more interesting questions for you, Victor, about the Germany, European Union, and the bilateral relationship between the European Union and China in the next 5 years after the 19th National Congress of the CPC was convened.
Thanks, Yang Ray. Yes, Victor, you know, one of the things we find when we're asking Europeans, whether it's people on the streets, as you saw there, whether it's businesses, one of the sort of automatic reactions you get is, oh, I don't know China that well. You know, I'm sort of slightly distrustful, if you like. I'm wondering, what is China doing to address that? You know, obviously this is a time when economic and political ties are growing. What about addressing that issue of building ties between people?
I think between China and Europe, and between China and many European countries, better understanding and better dialogue and communication are crucially important. China has been achieving huge transformation, especially in the economic sector, but political reform in China is also moving forward very rapidly, and we need to make all these changes well known to the European people, and we also need to make China's strategic intentions well known to the European people. And in doing so, I think a better understanding between China and Europe will lay the more strong foundation for our economic exchanges. I would say now there are millions of people from China visiting many European countries on an annual basis. Many Chinese students are studying in Europe. I think these people-to-people exchanges and dialogue between, for example, Chinese think tanks and European think tanks, universities, research institutions, etc., media entities, these will become more and more important in the coming years to promote better understanding between China and Europe.
Okay, one other question. Earlier this year, when Premier Li Keqiang was here, a few eyebrows were raised when Chancellor Merkel brought up this idea, a vision of a free trade agreement between China and the European Union. Obviously, there are still quite a lot of outstanding trade issues between China and the EU. How far do you see this economic relationship going? You know, do the Chinese government, for example, really think that a free trade deal is realistic at any point?
I personally believe the free trade agreement between China and EU is long overdue. Now that EU and Japan have signed up a free trade agreement, and EU and Canada, for example, are talking and about to sign up a free trade agreement, it is time for China and EU, which have bilateral trade above $600 billion every year, to come up with a free trade agreement which will be beneficial for both China and EU. And I think with the free trade agreement, mutual investments will be easier, and goods and services can move across from China to EU and vice versa in a much more free manner going forward. It will create more meaningful jobs here in China as well as in EU countries. It's a good thing, and both China and EU should feel more positive about how we can more quickly and more effectively sign up this free trade agreement.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Guy Henderson, for co-hosting this special program, yet another episode of our special series to celebrate the 19th National Congress of the CPC. And I also thank Mr. Victor Gao Zhikai for his insightful analysis on the policy issues concerning the European Union, China, and our bilateral relationship. With that, we come to the end of this Across the Line Questions for the 19th Congress of the CPC Special Series. Until next time, goodbye.